At exactly 10:37 a.m., on live national television, Elizabeth Warren leaned into the mic and said 5 words that cut through the country like a blade. Try harder if you're poor. In that instant, the air in the hearing room changed. 30 million working-class Americans watching from home felt something they knew too well. Not policy, not reform, but blame. She spoke with certainty, with data, with detachment. But across the aisle, J.D. Vance didn't move. He didn't argue, he didn't blink. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out one letter, folded, worn, carried for weeks like a quiet promise. He read it aloud, a letter from a mother who lost her son in Afghanistan and now loses sleep deciding whether to buy food or heat. As his voice cracked, the chamber fell completely silent. Not because they agreed, but because in that moment they finally heard. The story you are about to hear didn't happen exactly this way, but it could have. And for many in ways no camera ever captured, it already has. The names are fictional. The setting is imagined. But the silence in that room, the weight in that letter, the ache of being unheard, those are real. This isn't a retelling of fact. It's a reflection of truth, one drawn from the voices too often ignored and the dignity too often dismissed. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story. It's a truth too many still live. And so with millions watching, the curtain rose not on unity, but on a sentence that would fracture the room. The congressional chamber wasn't just full, it was pressurized. Every seat packed, every corridor lined with staffers, aides, and restless journalists clutching recorders like weapons. You could feel the heat from the lights. You could hear the hum of America listening, not through applause or cheers, but through anticipation. The issue on the table? Poverty policy reform, the unspoken truth, a silent war between data and dignity. Senator Elizabeth Warren stood, impeccably dressed in her trademark royal blue blazer, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She approached the podium with the precision of a seasoned general. Her voice was steady, measured, rehearsed, but sharp enough to draw blood if it needed to. "Let me be clear," she began, her words crisp like polished glass. "Poverty is a structural issue, but it is also a personal one, and we cannot fix what we refuse to confront." Her cadence was confident, with each sentence ticking like clockwork. Graphs were cited, studies projected on screens behind her. Harvard, Yale, think tanks from New York to San Francisco, all offered supporting theories. She spoke of cycles, incentive structures, behavioral economics. J.D. Vance watched in silence. Third row, stone-faced, a folded envelope in his jacket pocket. Warren continued, "We've invested in housing programs, in education grants, in retraining initiatives. But at some point, we have to be honest with ourselves and with the American people." The camera angle cut to the audience. An elderly black veteran leaned forward in his seat. A Latina mother with a food service badge fidgeted with the edge of her purse. A cameraman zoomed in on a silent pair of hands, trembling slightly, knuckles white. Warren didn't flinch. She delivered the final line like a gavel. "In this country, if you're still poor, maybe it's time to try harder." Silence. The room didn't gasp. It froze. Because what she said wasn't loud. It was worse. It was confident. One beat passed, then another. A slow ripple of shifting eyes and uncomfortable shuffles. But no one moved. Not yet. J.D. Vance leaned back, his hands folded tightly on the table before him. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. But something in his jaw tensed. Barely. He looked toward the press gallery. Cameras were still rolling. Behind him, a congressional intern whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Warren adjusted her mic. She believed what she said, and perhaps in her world of clean graphs and crisp margins, it even made sense. But out in Appalachia, where steel plants had turned into storage units, in the Midwest, where people paid more in insulin than in rent, and in West Virginia, where J.D. had last week held the hand of a mother still paying off her son's funeral, those 5 words would echo like a slap. Still, no one rebutted her. Not yet. Because in Washington, rebuttals take time, or something louder than facts. And J.D. Vance? He didn't plan to argue with a microphone. He planned to answer with a letter, but not yet. The cameras followed Warren as she returned to her seat, chin slightly lifted, unaware that every viewer over 50 who grew up on hard work and hope was now staring at their screen, not at her, but at the man who hadn't said a single word, and still wouldn't. Not yet, because when J.D. Vance finally stood, he wouldn't raise his voice. He would raise a memory, a story, a name, and that name would be written in the letter he kept close to his chest. The same letter that would break a silence and change a conversation no policy paper ever could. J.D. Vance didn't speak, not yet. He sat still, his right hand resting calmly on the table, while his left, just barely, moved across his chest to brush the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers touched it. The letter, still folded, still warm against his heart, as if it were waiting for permission to breathe. But he didn't unfold it. Across the aisle, the sound of shifting paper and low whispers filled the space left behind by Warren's words. The senator herself had returned to her seat, stone-faced, unaffected, or perhaps simply unwilling to reveal the storm she may or may not have felt brewing behind her. J.D. didn't look at her. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the room, like a man taking inventory, not of people, but of quiet wounds. In the back row, a black veteran in a pressed army jacket stiffened, his jaw clenched tight enough to show from across the room. He sat perfectly upright, but his knuckles folded on his lap were white with pressure. His gaze didn't move, didn't blink. It was the kind of stillness a soldier only shows when he's been hit in a place you can't bandage. 3 rows ahead, a woman with a janitor's badge clipped to her coat rose from her seat. She was middle-aged, hair pulled into a tight, work-worn bun, and she carried herself like someone used to waiting her turn. But this time she didn't wait. She quietly slipped out of the room, her exit silent but heavy. Not dramatic, but definitive, like a mother deciding this wasn't her space anymore. J.D. noticed. He noticed it all, and yet he remained still. The cameras had begun to shift, unsure where to focus. The burst of momentum from Warren's speech had stalled. It wasn't a walk-off moment. It was something else, something the media couldn't quite script. J.D. reached for a pen, then didn't use it. He laid it down. His silence wasn't passive. It was chosen. It was measured. It was a silence that carried more weight than outrage ever could. A young staffer leaned in from behind and whispered, "You're up next. Want a water?" J.D. shook his head, eyes fixed forward. His voice, if used now, would sound like everyone else's. Political, predictable, deflective. But that letter, that piece of worn, handwritten honesty, it wasn't predictable, and it wasn't political. It was human. He thought about Marlene as he touched the envelope again. He remembered her house, the chipped table where she folded that letter, and the way her hand trembled only once while sealing it. She hadn't asked him to read it, only to carry it. "Just hold it," she'd said, "in case they stop listening again." And now they had. He glanced toward the media gallery. Most were still focused on Warren, waiting to see if she would double down, apologize, or deflect. But one lens, one camera, had turned to him. A slow pan, no commentary, just waiting. He didn't look into the camera, but he knew it was there. And still, he said nothing. Because sometimes when a room is too loud, the most powerful thing a man can do is wait. Not in fear, not in anger, but in understanding. Understanding that the words he would eventually say weren't meant to win anything. They were meant to restore something, not applause, not a headline. Dignity. A small digital clock ticked on the wall. His name was next on the schedule. But J.D. didn't rise. He watched. He listened. He let the silence hold a shape. Because silence, when held long enough, becomes expectation. And expectation is the soil where a single voice, one calm, grounded, letter-born voice, can grow louder than a room full of microphones. He touched the letter once more, still folded, still waiting. So was he. The room never truly exhaled after Warren's 5 words. It simply shifted, from live tension to the manufactured storm of headlines. Within minutes, clips were uploaded. By the time J.D. Vance had stood and exited quietly through the side door, the phrase was already trending. Try harder if you're poor. Cable news anchors pounced. Some called it bold, others brave. One network branded it Warren's Tough Truth Moment, complete with on-screen graphics and urgent theme music. A familiar panel of political commentators filled a screen divided into squares, debating whether the senator had finally said what needed to be said. She's not wrong, one host said. There are programs. There are opportunities. Maybe it's time we stop coddling excuses. On another channel, the tone shifted. We just watched a U.S. senator tell working families that poverty is their fault. I mean, what world does she live in? The internet was less restrained. On one side, applause, sound bites, edits pairing her quote with fast-paced footage of bustling city success. On the other, fury, stitch videos, stories of job losses, bankruptcies, funeral bills. A single mother posted a video of her empty fridge with a caption, "Tell my kids to try harder, I guess." And through it all, people waited for one thing, J.D. Vance's response. They expected a press conference, maybe a primetime interview, a formal statement at least. But J.D. said nothing, not on camera, not in print. For 12 hours, he went silent. Then, at 6:42 a.m., he tweeted, no image, no thread, no explanation, just 12 words. Hard to try harder when the doors are locked from the outside. The tweet landed like a quiet thunderclap. Screenshots spread faster than the original quote. Commentators read it aloud, pausing after each half of the sentence. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and it cut in only the way truth could. Supporters called it the clapback of the year. Critics labeled it vague, dangerous populism, but no one ignored it. The tension shifted. Audiences were no longer just debating Warren. They were looking at Vance. What did he mean by that? Was he preparing something? Would he speak next session? Would he read the letter? Speculation bloomed. A CNN Chiron read, "Will J.D. Vance respond in full?" Fox ran a segment, Vance's silent strategy, masterstroke or mischance. A clip from C-SPAN of J.D. sitting silently during Warren's speech went viral. One TikTok creator overlaid the clip with music from The Gladiator. Another edited it like a boxing weigh-in, ending with, "He didn't flinch. She didn't blink. But the next round is coming." Meanwhile, inside homes across the Midwest, no one cared about clips or edits. They cared about tone. And J.D.'s tone, measured, restrained, and edged with weariness, felt familiar, felt like them. He didn't even raise his voice, one retired factory worker said in a diner in Youngstown, Ohio. But he said more than she did all day. By nightfall, new polls showed something surprising. Elizabeth Warren's net favorability had dropped 7 points among voters aged 50 and older in rural areas. J.D. Vance's name recognition had surged, but not for what he said, for what he hadn't said yet. And that was the power of silence. It left a space open wide enough for millions of Americans to fill with their own memory, their own story, their own invisible fight. Back in Washington, J.D. sat in his office. Lights dimmed, coat still folded over the chair. The letter was still there, still untouched. He placed it on his desk, flat, centered, as if it were watching him now. The time would come, but not yet. Because sometimes in politics, the words that matter most are the ones you wait longest to say. The road to Pine Hollow wasn't on most maps, not the kind people use for business trips or political campaigns. It curved off Route 19 like a memory, narrow, cracked, fading into the belly of West Virginia, where coal towns used to hum and now mostly whispered. It was raining, not the kind of rain that makes you rush, the kind that makes everything seem slower, sadder, more honest. J.D. Vance didn't mind. He liked driving in the quiet, especially here. These were the roads he understood, the ones where America didn't look like a spreadsheet. His windshield wipers clicked in rhythm as he pulled up to a house barely clinging to its foundation. Peeling siding, a collapsed porch swing, a U.S. flag hung from a rusted pole, drooping in the wet air. J.D. killed the engine. The tires hissed against the gravel. He stepped out and didn't bother with an umbrella. The screen door creaked open before he knocked. "Mr. Vance?" a voice called, gentle but firm. She stood in the doorway in worn jeans and a faded Marine Corps sweatshirt. Her hair was pulled back loosely. Her eyes looked tired, but not from sleep, from years. "Marlene Sanders," he said, tipping his head slightly. She gave a quick nod and motioned him in. "Shoes off, if you don't mind. Floors don't look it, but I mop." Inside, the house was warm but dim. A single lamp in the corner cast a soft amber glow across the living room. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old carpet. The walls were lined with photos, some black and white, some sun-faded, mostly of a young man in uniform, smiling, alive. JD took it in silently. His hand hovered near one of the frames. "That's James," Marlene said. "He was 24. Afghanistan. I keep all this up because if I take it down, it's like erasing him twice." JD nodded gently. He didn't offer the usual condolences. They never landed right here. She gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit. I got leftover biscuits or cold coffee, or both." He smiled politely. "I'll take both." They sat at a small round table, scarred with age. JD noticed the stack of bills held together by a rubber band near the salt shaker. Some envelopes were unopened. Most were marked final notice. She didn't hide them. That mattered. "They say we don't try," Marlene said after a long pause. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "I buried my son with military honors on a Tuesday, went to my first shift on Thursday, took another job the week after, cleaning the same high school he graduated from." JD listened. He didn't write anything down. This wasn't for notes. She kept going, slow and steady. "Then they closed the mine. Said solar was coming. Solar didn't come, but the bills did." Outside, the rain picked up, tapping gently against the window pane like someone unsure they were welcome. Marlene stood, walked to the counter, and picked up a folded piece of paper. She held it for a second, looked at it like it might dissolve if she breathed too hard. Then she walked back and placed it in front of him. "I don't want a speech. I don't want a spotlight. But if you ever find yourself in one of those rooms again, where they talk more about poverty than poor people, maybe you could read this." JD looked at the paper. It was handwritten. One page. No signature, no flourish. Just truth. "I'm not asking," she added. "Just offering." He picked it up and folded it again. He didn't read it right then. He wouldn't. Some letters weren't meant to be read when handed over. They were meant to be carried. Marlene stood still for a moment, then looked toward the wall of pictures. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You want to help us? Don't defend us. Don't excuse us. Just don't let them forget us." JD didn't promise her anything. He just nodded, slid the letter into his inside coat pocket and whispered, "I won't." JD didn't reach for the letter immediately. He let it sit there on the table between them, folded once, pressed flat by Marlene's hand, like something sacred. She didn't push it toward him, nor did she ask if he'd read it right away. She just looked at it, then at him, as if the real request wasn't in the paper, but in whether or not he'd carry it without turning it into spectacle. They sat like that for a few moments, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. JD traced the edge of his coffee mug with his finger. It was chipped and slightly cracked near the handle. Nothing fancy, just real. Marlene finally spoke again, and this time her voice was softer, more deliberate. "It's not for me," she said, eyes never leaving the envelope. "It's for them, for whenever they stop listening again." JD lifted his gaze. "Who's them?" She gave a small shrug. "Pick a building with marble floors and cameras. Pick a committee with talking points. Pick a room where the word poverty gets tossed around by people who've never skipped dinner to feed their kid." He nodded but didn't interrupt. "Don't read it here," she added, almost like a warning. "You read it too soon. It becomes yours. That letter's not yours, not yet. You're just carrying it." JD understood. Still, as he got up to leave, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the envelope in his jacket, like it was heavier than paper had any right to be. He thanked her again, quietly, with the same nod he'd given grieving families before. It wasn't the kind of moment that needed handshakes or long goodbyes. The act of taking the letter was the goodbye. The rain hadn't stopped outside. It had grown colder, the kind of rain that sinks into your sleeves and stays. JD didn't mind. He climbed into the truck, shut the door, and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. No music, no phone. Just him, the rain, and the letter. It was late by the time he pulled into a roadside rest stop near Charleston. The kind with vending machines that never worked, and bathrooms that always hummed under fluorescent lights. He parked beneath a broken lamp and turned off the ignition. For a minute, he sat in silence, listening to the clicks of the engine cooling down. Then he reached inside his coat. He unfolded the letter carefully, slowly, as if the words might slip out too fast if he wasn't gentle with them. The paper was lined, slightly wrinkled. The handwriting was neat but pressed too hard, as if every word had to be carved through emotion to make it onto the page. The first line hit him like a whisper in a cathedral. "I don't want your sympathy. I want your memory." He kept reading. "We don't ask for favors. We ask not to be forgotten. We don't want rescue. We want recognition. That we are still here, still trying, still walking uphill while being told we should have flown by now." JD stopped, folded the paper again. He didn't need to read the rest. Not yet. The point had already been made, and made perfectly. This wasn't a complaint. It was a record of dignity, of pain that refused to dress itself up in politics. A woman who had lost a son, worked 2 jobs, and somehow still believed her words might matter in a room full of suits. Back on the road, the letter stayed in the breast pocket of his jacket. Close enough to feel, close enough to remind him that the next time someone said, "Try harder," he wouldn't answer with a headline. He'd answer with her words, and the silence that would follow. That would be the real testimony. The rain hadn't let up. It draped the windshield in long, slow rivers, making every headlight from oncoming traffic smear across the glass like ghosts. J.D. Vance drove in silence, the heater humming low, the letter resting in the inside pocket of his coat like a pulse against his chest. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence mattered now. Marlene's words echoed, not in full, not in detail, but in the way truth lingers after it's been spoken plainly. "We don't want your sympathy. We want your memory." That line wrapped around him like a thread, tugging at something older, something personal. Somewhere along the highway, the world blurred. Not from the rain, but from the sting in his eyes. He blinked hard. Once, then again. But the images kept coming. His mother at a grocery store checkout, fumbling with food stamps and shaking hands while JD, maybe 10 years old, stood beside her, clutching a bag of rice like it was treasure. The cashier's face, tired, impatient, watching the register beep in judgment. The man behind them sighing loudly. JD remembered thinking, "We're holding up their world. We shouldn't be here." Another flash. Cold winters in Middletown. His mom wrapping her hands around a mug of water she called coffee because they couldn't afford the real thing that week. He remembered the way she smiled through it, made jokes, but looked away when he asked if the lights would stay on. He gripped the wheel tighter. Now, decades later, a senator on live television had said it again. Not in so many words, but close enough. "Try harder." And just like that, the air had shifted. The room, the internet, the country. Like poverty was a puzzle anyone could solve with enough discipline and better habits. But JD knew better. He knew Marlene was just one of thousands, maybe millions. People who didn't want a bailout, who didn't expect applause, who didn't demand attention, just asked not to be erased. The kind of Americans who fixed their own sinks, buried their own children, and showed up to work even when no one showed up for them. He exhaled hard through his nose. The windshield wipers thumped a little faster. A blue highway sign passed. "Welcome to Kanawha County." JD's voice broke the silence, low and almost to himself. "They'll hear this." He said it like a vow, like a promise sworn not to Marlene, but to all the rooms like hers, the ones filled with framed photos, unpaid bills, and courage no camera ever catches. He didn't know when or how he'd read the letter. Not yet. It had to be the right moment, not just for impact, but for respect. Words like Marlene's weren't meant to be used. They were meant to be honored. He pulled off onto an overlook halfway back to Charleston, parking on the edge of the ridge where the trees bowed low and the fog crawled like smoke across the road. He killed the engine, let the heat fade from the vents, and stared out across the valley. In the distance, small homes clung to the hillsides like stubborn prayers. He sat there for a long time. Then slowly, he opened the glove box and took out a notepad. No speech, no outline, just a heading for the next hearing. Beneath it, he wrote 4 words. Don't forget her name. That was all. The letter stayed in his pocket. The rain kept falling, but something in the silence felt different now. Less like absence, more like preparation, as if the road itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the words would be spoken. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. And when that moment came, J.D. Vance knew it wouldn't be about him. It would be about what America heard when it finally listened. The backlash came quickly and predictably. But Elizabeth Warren didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned in harder. 3 days after the hearing, she appeared on Stateline Sunday, a flagship political morning show known more for theater than substance. The host opened with a clip of her infamous line, "If you're still poor, maybe it's time to try harder." The studio lights dimmed as the footage played, then rose slowly to find Warren composed, centered, and entirely unapologetic. "Senator," the host asked carefully, "you've been accused of blaming the poor. Would you like to clarify?" Warren smiled, not smug but certain. "I think we need to stop mistaking honesty for cruelty," she said. "Empathy is good, but tough love is better for long-term progress." That phrase, tough love, was clipped, highlighted, looped. Within minutes, it had become its own headline. She went on, citing examples. Families who had climbed out of debt, students who'd beaten the odds, communities that had reinvented themselves after factories closed. Her tone was academic, crisp. Her message, the system is hard but not impossible, and if some people can make it, maybe others just need to try harder. The host pressed her once more. "But what about those who feel left behind?" Warren gave a diplomatic nod. "I understand their pain, but change doesn't come through comfort. It comes through challenge." Across the country, reactions exploded. Some praised her for being brave enough to speak without filters. Others accused her of coldness, wrapped in policy language. Clips of her interview flooded the internet. One viral video edited her words over scenes of boarded-up homes, empty factories, and funerals. The same communities she claimed could reinvent themselves. In Washington, the press waited for the counterpunch. All eyes turned to J.D. Vance, but he said nothing. He declined appearances on Meet the Nation, American Morning, and a primetime invitation from a major network that had cleared an entire segment just for him. Producers were baffled. Reporters speculated. "He's dodging," one said. "He's strategizing," said another. Behind closed doors, a senior advisor to Vance offered a different view. "He's waiting because this isn't about media, it's about timing, and when he speaks, no one's going to interrupt him." That, more than anything, kept the tension simmering. Warren's team released a short video doubling down further. Her walking through a community center, pointing to programs she helped fund, smiling beside college-bound students. The message was clear. She wasn't backing off. She believed in her words, her approach, her data. But out in places like Dayton, Ohio, and Beckley, West Virginia, the response was different. "She's got charts. We've got overdue bills," one man posted online. "I don't need her love. Tough or not," another woman tweeted. "I just need a job where I don't have to skip my meds to pay for gas." Still, J.D. remained silent. At home, he read the letter again, just once, then folded it back with care and returned it to the inner pocket of his jacket, the same one he wore the day Warren spoke. His phone buzzed with alerts, requests, opinion polls. He silenced it. It wasn't time yet. He didn't want to be a segment. He wanted to be a sentence that stayed. One night, sitting in his garage with only a legal pad and the hum of a distant freight train in the background, J.D. scribbled something in the margin of his notes. Just 4 words. "Don't fight her words." He underlined it. Because this wasn't about fighting Elizabeth Warren. This wasn't even about fighting her ideas. It was about proving, through one voice, one letter, one truth, that the real power in Washington didn't come from who shouted first. It came from who listened last. 3 days after Warren's interview aired, a quiet ripple stirred beneath the noise. It didn't begin on cable news. It didn't trend on TikTok. It appeared almost modestly in the Ohio Ledger, a respected but local paper, the kind read over black coffee, not blasted across headlines. The byline simply read, J.D. Vance. The title, What If She's Never Been Poor? It wasn't a rebuttal. It didn't name names. There were no statistics, no direct quotes, no mention of Warren or her now infamous phrase. But from the first sentence, anyone paying attention knew exactly who and what it was about. It's easy to speak about poverty with confidence when poverty has never spoken to you. It's easy to say try harder from a balcony built by someone else's hands. JD's words weren't angry. They were precise, calm, almost quiet on the page, but no less cutting. He didn't argue against policy. He didn't reject personal responsibility. He questioned something deeper, the right to moralize when you've never had to choose between paying the light bill or buying your kids antibiotics. Midway through the op-ed, his tone shifted. There's a kind of pain that never raises its voice. The mother who works double shifts, the grandfather who sells his pickup to pay for insulin, the teenager who skips lunch every day so his younger sister doesn't have to. These people don't need slogans. They don't need saving. They need to not be erased. Then, without preamble, he quoted the letter. Not the name, not the context, just the words. We don't ask for favors. We ask not to be forgotten. That single line hit harder than any headline. It lingered, like it didn't just belong in the article, but belonged outside it. A phrase that could live on posters, on church bulletins, on protest signs written in Sharpie and frustration. The letter wasn't referenced again. JD didn't explain who wrote it. He didn't mention Marlene. He didn't hint that there was more to come. Because this wasn't about revealing something. It was about planting something. By nightfall, the op-ed had been reprinted in the Washington Dispatch, the Times Review, and the Hill Report. By morning, it was being quoted on morning radio across the Midwest and South. Some called it literary bait. Others said it was a masterclass in rhetorical restraint. But most just said this. He's not yelling, but he's making us listen. On social media, screenshots of the quote spread. Veterans shared it, teachers shared it. One user posted the line with a caption that read, I've never felt more seen by 12 words. Cable news tried to spin it. One anchor accused JD of hiding behind poetic language. If he has something to say to Senator Warren, he should say it directly. But that missed the point entirely. JD wasn't writing to her. He was writing to the people she had forgotten to face. That night, alone in his home office, JD sat at his desk with the letter in front of him again. He didn't read it. He just kept it there. As a reminder, he had spoken, but not fully. The room had heard him. The country had stirred. But he knew, deep down, the silence wasn't done yet. The real words still waited. And when they came, he wouldn't need to write them. He'd read them. The op-ed hit like a slow fuse. Quiet at first, almost polite in tone. But by the third day, the fire had caught. And it didn't take long for it to rage. On Capitol Hill, Warren's allies circled the wagons. Several staffers from her office anonymously leaked statements to friendly outlets, accusing J.D. Vance of engaging in emotional populism dressed up as moral clarity. One strategist even suggested he was weaponizing sentimentality to undermine legitimate policy discussions. The term caught on fast. Emotional populism. Cable news grabbed it like a lifeline, spinning it into graphics and hashtags. Pundits went to war, debating whether Vance's restraint was strategic manipulation or genuine leadership. One editorial from a prominent progressive site claimed, Vance hides behind pain to avoid hard numbers. Another headline, no plan, just poetry. But outside the Beltway, the story looked very different. Inside JD's inbox, something else was happening. Veterans wrote in first, hundreds of them, then thousands. She said what they always say. Tell her I buried my best friend in Kandahar and came home to a closed factory. I didn't survive 2 tours to be told I'm lazy. Then came the letters from factory workers. From Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. 3 generations in the same plant. Then the shutdown notice came on a Monday morning. No warning, no options. They said retrain, at 52, with a mortgage and a grandbaby to raise. And finally, the mothers. I clean rooms at a hotel in Charlotte. I take a bus to work at 4:45 a.m. I work weekends. I haven't had a sick day in 8 years. And now I'm told I need to try harder? Many messages were just a single line. Read the whole letter. His staff could barely keep up. The email queues overflowed. His social media inboxes were flooded with screenshots, scanned letters, even voice memos from grandparents and young single parents saying the same thing. Don't let her words be the last thing they hear. Some begged him to respond. Others simply said thank you. Not for what he had said, but for not saying everything yet. It wasn't about rebuttal anymore. It was about resonance. Meanwhile, Warren's office doubled down, releasing a policy memo detailing all federal assistance programs available to low-income Americans. The tone was defensive, technical. It listed percentages, income brackets, subsidies, but it didn't list people. No names, no faces, no letters. That was the difference, and it was widening. A local station in Kentucky interviewed 3 families affected by job losses over the past year. One of them, a mother named Carla, held up a printed copy of JD's op-ed and said, "This felt more honest than anything I've heard in a long time. It doesn't promise anything. It just doesn't forget me." But not everyone praised him. Several economists took to Twitter to accuse JD of avoiding facts. A former Obama speechwriter criticized him for hiding behind working-class pain to avoid engaging in real solutions. One editorialist even accused him of passive performance. JD didn't respond. He didn't tweet, didn't post, didn't appear on air. He met privately with his team and said only one thing. This isn't a war of words. It's a matter of when to speak and what deserves to be said out loud. That night he reread the letter, not to prepare, to remember. He turned off his phone, sat in silence, watched the inbox flood. Because a storm had come, but it wasn't made of outrage. It was made of voices that had waited too long, and now they were rising. By the time J.D. Vance walked through the Capitol's west entrance, the air already felt different. It wasn't the cold marble or the distant hum of footsteps that set the tone. It was the weight of a room already holding its breath. The next committee hearing on poverty reform had been scheduled weeks in advance, but now it carried the electricity of an unscripted reckoning. Reporters lined the corridor leading into the chamber, shoulder to shoulder, some live streaming from their phones, others whispering into earpieces. Producers mouthed countdowns from behind camera rigs. "We're live in 30, 29. Inside the room, nothing looked unusual. Not on the surface. The same chairs, the same water pitchers, the same stiff formality. But the people weren't the same. Not anymore. Elizabeth Warren sat at the center left of the panel, surrounded by papers stacked neatly, color-coded tabs peeking out like sentinels. She wore gray today, not blue, but the posture remained the same. Upright, composed, unshaken. A senior advisor leaned down to her shoulder and murmured something. She gave the slightest nod. Across from her, JD took his seat in silence. No phone, no notes. Just a plain folder and that familiar, worn envelope resting inside his inner coat pocket. No one had seen it yet, but somehow everyone felt its presence. The chair called the session to order with the usual gavel tap. Formalities passed quickly. Then came the main agenda item: evaluating structural and personal accountability in poverty policy, a bureaucrat's title for a moral battlefield. Warren was called to speak first. She rose, greeted the panel, and began calmly. Her words were polished, as expected. The data shows that federal interventions over the past decade have improved baseline security for families across income brackets. Charts appeared on the side monitors. Employment trends, welfare-to-work transitions, child nutrition benchmarks. She cited studies from Brookings, policy reviews from the Congressional Budget Office, longitudinal casework from MIT. Her tone was not smug. It was assured, built on years of institutional trust and polished media training. "No one is saying these communities don't struggle," she added, hands gesturing gently. "But we must also acknowledge where opportunity has worked. We must reward effort, not just need." Another chart, another analysis. Outside the frame of the cameras, an aide scribbled notes. A few heads nodded, but the air remained taut, stretched thin between technical certainty and emotional disbelief. Warren looked across the aisle once, briefly, at JD. Her gaze flickered, then returned to her binder. She was nearly done when she said it. Empathy alone cannot drive policy. The numbers must. A perfectly reasonable line, delivered without malice. But in the current atmosphere, it felt like a cold wind brushing the back of the nation's neck. JD didn't react, at least not outwardly. But a journalist in the third row noted the moment his hand moved, slowly, subtly, to adjust the inner flap of his coat. Just enough to check that the envelope was still there. The moment passed quickly. The chair thanked Warren for her remarks and turned to the next speaker. A murmur rustled through the back benches. "Senator Vance," the chair said, "the floor is yours." Cameras pivoted, pens lifted, viewers across the country leaned forward. But JD didn't speak. Not yet. He reached into his coat and drew out the envelope, unfolded it, and set it gently on the table before him. He looked at it like a compass, because in a room full of charts and cameras and credentials, he didn't come with numbers. He came with a voice, and that voice was about to be heard. JD Vance didn't rise quickly. He moved like a man measuring the weight of the moment before stepping into it. His chair creaked softly as he stood, a sound barely audible over the shifting of bodies and the sudden quieting of the chamber. The cameras zoomed in, not on his face but on his hands. One reached into his coat, deliberate, unrushed. He pulled out the folded envelope, the same one he'd carried through rain and silence and cable news firestorms. He didn't open it yet. He placed it carefully on the table in front of him, then looked up toward the chair. "Mr. Chairman," he began, voice steady but low, "before I speak on the subject at hand, I'd like to request permission to enter something into the congressional record." There was a pause, then a nod from the chair. "Go ahead, Senator." JD nodded once softly. "But before I do that," he said, turning slightly to address the room, "I'd like to read it aloud." The sentence landed with quiet force. He lifted the envelope again, unfolded the single sheet inside, and held it between his hands like something fragile. Not because the paper would tear, but because what it carried deserved more than casual handling. He didn't rush, didn't clear his throat. He just began. "I don't want your sympathy. I want your memory." A ripple moved through the chamber. Not a sound, just a stillness. The kind that occurs when everyone leans in, but no one wants to be seen doing it. JD's voice didn't rise. It wasn't theatrical, but it held something stronger than volume, restraint. "I buried my son on a Tuesday. I returned to work on Thursday, not because I was ready, but because I had no choice. The bills didn't care who I lost." He paused, on just for a moment. No one interrupted. "I've worked 2 jobs since then. I clean offices I'll never step into as an equal. I mop floors in buildings where people talk about me without ever speaking to me." A senator 2 seats down lowered her pen. "They say people like me don't try hard enough, but trying doesn't look the same when you're climbing with no shoes, no rope, and a weight on your back that never lets up." JD took another breath, steady and slow. "We don't ask for favors. We ask not to be forgotten." That was the line, the one from the op-ed, the one the country had quoted, tweeted, tattooed onto protest signs, and pasted in the windows of diners in towns most people only see from the air. Now it had a voice. Now it had a face. JD looked up, not to the cameras, not to the crowd, but to the names he knew were watching from rooms just like Marlene's. Living rooms, break rooms, veterans' halls, corners of the country where nobody ever thinks policy reaches, except when it forgets them. He folded the letter again, gently, and placed it in the folder in front of him. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "That's all I have for now." No speech, no graphs, no applause. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of everything the room hadn't heard in years. The chair blinked, unsure of how to respond. Warren's pen was frozen midair. A staffer near the back lowered his phone, as if something about recording felt suddenly invasive. And across the country, millions of viewers stared at their screens, not because they were waiting for what came next, but because they had just heard something that didn't sound like Washington at all. It sounded like them. J.D. Vance held the letter open again, fingers steady this time. He didn't look up, didn't scan the room. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved like a current under the surface, slow and cold and impossible to ignore. My son died wearing a flag. I wear his dog tags because I can't afford heat. The words sat in the air like smoke, visible, but impossible to grasp. The sound in the chamber thinned to nothing. The typing stopped. The coughs held. Even the echo of footsteps in the hallway outside seemed to vanish, as if the building itself understood something had shifted. J.D. didn't pause for effect. He wasn't performing. He was delivering something that didn't belong to him, and that obligation made every syllable sacred. I don't know the language of policy. I know the language of price tags, shut-off notices, and empty prescription bottles. A low intake of breath came from somewhere behind the press box. Someone near the back straightened in their chair, then immediately sat back down, as if even moving too loud might disrespect the voice on the page. You don't know what poor is. You know what policy feels like on paper. He didn't look at Warren when he read it, but others did. Her pen was still in her hand, but unmoving, hovering. Her expression was unreadable, the kind polished in debate prep and press training, but her posture had changed, not defensive, not combative, just still. J.D. continued, we wake up early, not to seize opportunity, but to catch what falls through the cracks. We work tired because tired is cheaper than hungry, and we don't complain because even pain costs energy. A congresswoman 2 rows over, sharp-suited, known more for sharp questions than softness, sat forward, lips slightly parted. She mouthed a single word. Wow. It wasn't sarcasm, it was surrender. You talk about accountability, so do we. But ours doesn't come from podiums. It comes from counting pills to make the month last, from selling old medals to buy new shoes. J.D.'s voice broke then, not in pitch, but in pacing. A small breath caught in his chest. He paused. Just a heartbeat, just long enough for the chamber to feel it. I don't need pity. I need you to remember that we are still here, and we are still trying. He folded the letter again, slowly, almost ceremonially, as if every crease was another line sealed into history. He placed it back into the folder in front of him, then closed the folder with finality. And still, he didn't look around. He didn't need to, because silence was louder than applause. And this silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't discomfort. It was respect. Even the chair, a man known for cutting time limits with surgical precision, didn't speak right away. He adjusted his microphone, looked down at his notes, and then simply said, "Thank you, Senator Vance." No one clapped. No one needed to. Out in the nation, screens across kitchen tables and corner bar TVs held that frozen image, J.D. with his hands folded, the letter now closed, in a room that finally had nothing to say, because for once they had listened. By midnight, the hearing room had emptied, but the country had just begun to fill. Somewhere between J.D. folding the letter and placing it down, a congressional media intern hit publish on the live stream timestamp. The clip, in just under 4 minutes, began with J.D.'s quiet voice and ended with the silence that followed. It didn't have flashy graphics or stirring music, just raw words in a room that couldn't look away, and America didn't. By 1:43 a.m., the clip had hit 200,000 views on YouTube. By sunrise, it had crossed 4 million. It wasn't just being watched, it was being replayed, quoted, whispered, sent in group chats between veterans, teachers, single parents. People who had never heard of Marlene Sanders before now heard her in their own reflections. On TikTok, the clip was reposted by a 19-year-old from Scranton with the caption, "My mom works 2 jobs. I never saw her cry. She cried watching this." The algorithm took care of the rest. Hashtag read her letter began trending first. Then came hashtag hear us now. Then simply hashtag Marlene. News anchors struggled to summarize what had happened. They played the clip, then played it again, because explaining it didn't work. It had to be heard, and more importantly, felt. Veterans groups were among the first to respond in force. From Ohio to Georgia, chapters issued open letters to Congress demanding immediate attention to what they now called the Marlene Act, a proposed initiative to provide cost-of-living support for families of deceased service members, especially in low-income rural areas. The proposal hadn't even been drafted yet, but the public had already passed it in their hearts. Editorial pages lit up with commentary. Some called it the return of moral politics. Others dubbed JD's moment the most important 4 minutes of congressional testimony in a generation. What struck most viewers wasn't just the words, it was the silence. He didn't yell, one op-ed noted. He didn't even raise his voice, but he made them all listen. And that's rarer than applause in Washington. The official hearing page on C-SPAN crashed from overload. Church groups downloaded the clip to play during Sunday sermons. A high school civics teacher in Michigan paused her curriculum and showed it in class. A student stood up afterward and asked, "Is that what leadership's supposed to sound like?" One voice memo sent to JD's office simply said, "I don't know who that woman is, but I think I've been her for the last 10 years. His staff couldn't keep up with the calls. Hundreds of voicemails flooded in. Some didn't even leave messages, just sobs, or a breath, or a long silence before the beep. And through it all, JD didn't post, didn't speak. He sat in his office and watched the country move, not because he pushed it, but because he had finally stepped out of its way. He glanced at the folded letter still resting on his desk, now sealed in a protective sleeve, but still unframed. It wasn't a trophy, it wasn't a relic, it was a reminder. A few feet away, a staffer knocked gently and entered. "Senator, veterans groups are asking if you'd consider naming the bill after her." JD looked at the screen one more time, now filled with a mosaic of faces, blue-collar workers, Gold Star families, children holding hand-lettered signs that simply read, "Read her letter." He gave a single nod. "Call it the Marlene Act," because now the letter wasn't just hers, it was the country's. The next evening, Elizabeth Warren appeared on MSNBC. The studio was slick, blue-lit, calm. The host offered her a gentle prompt. "Senator, your words last week, 'If you're still poor, maybe it's time to try harder,' have sparked a national firestorm. How do you respond?" She didn't flinch. Her tone, refined and professorial, held no apology. "I was speaking from data," she said. "We have programs. We have safety nets. But generational poverty often requires generational responsibility. If we only feel and never fix, we fail." The host nodded politely. The clip cut. But online, the reaction was anything but polite. The backlash came fast and came loud. "She called herself a voice for the working class," one Twitter post read, "but now she's shaming the working wounded." Commentators took sides. Pundits picked their battlegrounds. Fox News ran with the headline, "Warren doubles down. Poor people just need to try harder." Progressive think tanks released studies on structural inequity, blasting JD for what they called weaponized anecdotalism. The Atlantic published an op-ed titled, "When Truth Hurts and When It Just Hurts." Supporters of Warren defended her. "We can't govern with sentimentality. We need policies built on evidence, not letters." Critics pushed back harder. She had evidence. He had experience. Only one of them left the country in tears. In response to the noise, JD remained silent for 2 days. But when he finally did speak, it wasn't a soundbite. He stood before a modest press podium at a veterans town hall in Toledo. No teleprompter, no speechwriter, just a microphone and a room filled with people who didn't need cameras to care. "She was right about data," JD began, voice steady, "but wrong about dignity." The room fell still. There's a difference between numbers and names, between fixing systems and facing lives. When a mother says she can't afford to bury her son, that's not emotion. That's America. The clip went viral. Again. And this time, the divide didn't just run through politics. It ran through dinner tables, office break rooms, church basements. A teacher in Phoenix tweeted, "I teach the statistics. I believe in numbers. But my students believe in stories." JD didn't prove her wrong. He proved us incomplete. But some weren't moved. A prominent economist wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "We've entered an era where feelings override facts. That's not leadership. That's theater." And Warren? She returned to Capitol Hill with poise intact, introducing a 200-page amendment package on economic mobility, packed with graphs, metrics, and case studies. Her office released a statement. "We applaud passion, but policymaking must remain grounded in reality." In a quiet counter-move, JD filed paperwork to draft the Marlene Act as formal legislation, co-sponsored not by partisans, but by independents, moderates, and 2 Vietnam veterans-turned-senators who hadn't spoken on a bill in over a year. The divide was clear now, not just left versus right, but felt versus proven, living versus managing, empathy versus efficiency. And somewhere between the headlines and hashtags, a young waitress in Alabama pinned a printed quote to her fridge. She was right about data, but wrong about dignity. She looked at her sleeping toddler, rubbed her aching wrist from a double shift, and whispered, "Dignity. That's what we're still trying to afford." They didn't expect her to say anything. Not really. Marlene hadn't answered reporters. She didn't write think pieces or record teary live streams. But 3 days after JD read her letter before Congress, a small AM station in southern Ohio posted an announcement on Facebook. "Tonight at 7 p.m., a conversation with Marlene." The post was shared 90,000 times in 2 hours. By the time the host went live, the call board had maxed out. Emails flooded in. The live stream lagged under the pressure. But there she was, on the air, soft-spoken, steady. No makeup, no notes, no spin. The host greeted her gently. "You've become the face of something bigger, Marlene. Why now? Why this?" She exhaled. "Because I didn't write that letter to be read. I wrote it to be felt." The host paused. "And when J.D. Vance read it out loud, what did that mean to you?" She didn't answer right away. Then, he didn't raise his voice. He raised mine. It was quiet for a moment. Radio silence, literally. Then she continued. "For a long time, folks like me, mothers who bury sons, workers who age faster than their years, we've been talked about like math problems, like statistics that won't go away. But I'm not a number, and I didn't write a sob story." She straightened in her chair, voice unwavering. "I wrote what I live, and I don't want anyone in that room, or watching at home, to forget that we are not broken. We are just tired of shouting into rooms that listen only to themselves." The radio host leaned in. "Some are calling this the Marlene moment. Did you ever imagine your words would start a movement?" She chuckled, low and worn. "No, I just wanted them to stop blaming us for drowning in water they poured." Then came the moment that would be clipped and replayed for weeks. "I didn't ask Mr. Vance to read that letter," she said, "but I thank him, because in that room, filled with policy and power, he reminded them that dignity doesn't require applause, just acknowledgement." Newsrooms across the country cut into programming with the audio. Talk shows played it under strings and piano. Warren, when asked about the interview, only said, "I respect her experience. But we govern from the general, not the personal." That line fell flat online. A retired Marine tweeted, "Everything's general until it's your kid in the ground." And back in Ohio, the local station replayed Marlene's final comment 3 times that night. "If they want to name a bill after me, that's fine. But don't do it for show. Do it because you finally heard us." That quote would be stenciled on protest signs, printed on T-shirts, and whispered in community halls from Georgia to Montana. The moment wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about presence, about someone like Marlene, invisible for decades, becoming undeniable. The amendment was only 2 pages long. No sweeping economic overhaul, no flashy name at first, just a quiet proposal slid into the poverty reform docket. Energy assistance for families of deceased service members living below the federal line. The kind of bill that usually gets buried under bureaucratic shuffle until J.D. Vance stood up and named it. The Marlene provision. He said it simply, like stating a fact. Some senators stiffened, others glanced around, unsure whether it was a political play or something deeper. But Vance didn't yield the floor. He explained, There are mothers in this country whose sons died wearing our flag, and now they live by candlelight when the grid fails. We debate dignity from a distance. I'm asking us to deliver it, quietly and quickly. He made no mention of Warren. No glares, no bait. Just the bill and its name. The chamber was still, but the media wasn't. Headlines exploded by noon. J.D. Vance introduces Marlene provision, forces Democrats to choose. A veteran's mother may reshape energy policy. From grief to law, the letter that moved the Senate. And then just past 5 p.m., the press caught wind of something else. Elizabeth Warren had requested a private meeting with Marlene. No aides, no media, no mics. They met in a small side office near the Capitol Rotunda, a place where marble met worn carpet and history exhaled through dusty blinds. Marlene arrived with a single tote bag and wore the same coat she had in the radio interview. Warren stood waiting, arms crossed at first, unsure how to begin, but it was Marlene who spoke first. "You read the letter?" she asked. Warren nodded, her voice catching. "Twice, maybe more." A pause. Then Warren whispered, almost to herself, "I thought I understood poverty. I wrote books about it, studied the structures, but I never buried a child. I never stood in line to choose between light or heat." She looked up, eyes brimming. "I got it wrong." "I did." Marlene didn't smile, but her shoulders softened. "I didn't want your guilt," she said. "I wanted your help." And for the first time, Elizabeth Warren cried, not performatively, not politically, just as a woman, one who had spoken too quickly and listened too late. They sat in silence for a while. No sound but the low hum of a heater in the wall and the faint murmur of footsteps outside the closed door. Finally, Warren asked, "Do you want the provision to carry your name?" Marlene looked at her, tired but clear-eyed. "No," she said, "but I wanted to carry our promise." And that was the beginning of the shift. In the days that followed, more senators signed on. A few tried to rebrand it with safer language. J.D. refused. Warren didn't argue. When the amendment passed committee, it bore one name still, unchanged: the Marlene provision. The room smelled like old paper and ambition. It wasn't a hearing chamber. It was smaller, carpeted, wood-paneled, dimly lit. A place where decisions were shaped before they ever touched a microphone. The kind of room where compromise was currency and conviction was often optional. J.D. Vance stood at one end of the oval table. His coat was still buttoned. His hands, resting calmly on the leather folder in front of him, didn't shake, though the room around him buzzed with discomfort. "Look," one senior senator said, voice low but firm, "you've made your point. It was powerful. But now we need to fold it into the main bill. Soften the language. Make it less about one woman's pain, more about bipartisan goals." Another added quickly, "The optics are risky, J.D. You're tying the party to a story." One that wasn't vetted. J.D. didn't flinch. He scanned the faces around him. Men and women who'd spent decades measuring their words like currency, calculating every vote like it was a stock to hedge. They weren't cruel, just careful. And that was the problem. "You want to make it less personal?" J.D. asked, tone steady. "But poverty is personal." No one replied. He continued, "You want me to tone it down because it's inconvenient, because it doesn't poll well in places where dinner still comes hot. But this story, her story, is real. And if you're afraid of that, then maybe it's not her letter that's too loud. Maybe it's our silence that's been too long." A long pause settled in. Then from the corner, a moderate senator leaned in. "Just answer this, J.D. Is this about Elizabeth Warren?" That did it. J.D. looked directly at him, gaze unwavering. "No, it's not about her. It's about us." He stepped back from the table, his voice now quiet but resolute. "I'm not doing this for airtime. I didn't read that letter because I wanted to win a headline. I read it because I needed to know if this room could still feel something." No one dared interrupt. "Call it the Marlene provision, or don't," J.D. said, "but I'm not watering it down. I'm not framing grief into a press release. I'm not going to let this place teach me that decency needs trimming." The room sat in silence, not out of agreement, but out of something rarer: respect. Finally, the senior senator who spoke first closed his binder and nodded. more to himself than anyone else. "You're sticking to it then?" JD nodded once. "Yes, because this time, we either do something that matters, or we go back to doing what's safe." And with that, he left the room. Not triumphant, not angry, just sure. And in the silence he left behind, a few minds began to shift. Not loudly, but deeply. The chamber was quieter than usual, not out of respect, but tension. Even the clicking of pens and the shuffling of papers seemed restrained, as if the room itself sensed it was teetering between two very different versions of history. J.D. Vance sat in his chair, posture firm, but his eyes scanning. He wasn't looking at the other committee members. He already knew where most of them stood. He was looking at the gallery, a quiet row of faces watching democracy hold its breath. Veterans, caregivers, teachers, and somewhere, he hoped, her. The vote began. The chair read the title of the amendment aloud. "An addition to Section B to establish the Marlene provision, addressing transitional support for military families below the poverty line." JD barely blinked. "Aye," came the first voice. Then a nay. Then another aye. It was close, every syllable a weight, every pause a blade. One senator hesitated, looked up, met JD's eyes. JD gave no signal, just a stillness that said, "You already know what's right." "Aye." Another. "Nay." It was 6-6, one vote left. The room tensed. The final senator was known for abstaining on anything controversial. His hand hovered over the microphone. JD could hear a reporter's pen stop moving in the gallery. Then, "Aye." The amendment passed, 7-6. No eruption, no thunderous applause, just a small breath from someone in the gallery, like they'd been holding it for too long. Then slowly, a single pair of hands clapped, and then another, and another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't for the cameras, but it was real. JD looked up. There she was. Marlene, standing in the gallery, back straight, eyes glassy. She held something in her hands. At first, he thought it was a folded handkerchief, but no, it was a pair of dog tags. JD froze for half a second. Those tags weren't just metal. They were memory, service, sacrifice, and now something more. Proof that voices once ignored had finally been heard. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She just nodded. Once. JD nodded back, his chest rising, but he kept still. He knew the cameras would cut to him. But this moment wasn't for the media. It was for the mother who wrote a letter, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. It was for the son who never made it home. It was for the quiet ones in the gallery who showed up without yelling. As the committee moved on to the next item on the agenda, most of the room returned to form, flipping papers, checking phones. But JD didn't. He sat there for one more minute, letting the gravity settle in. Not for dramatics, for memory. Because if the chamber forgot this moment tomorrow, he wouldn't. He stood, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for her. And the sound that lingered behind him wasn't applause. It was something rarer. Respect. The morning bell rang in a rusting Ohio town where steel mills had once echoed louder than ambition. In room 213 of Maple Hollow High, a civics teacher named Mrs. Kelton dimmed the fluorescent lights and clicked play on a grainy C-SPAN clip projected against a faded whiteboard. J.D. Vance's voice filled the room. Not booming, not rehearsed, just steady. He read, "She wrote, 'We don't ask for favors. We ask not to be forgotten.'" Not a whisper in the classroom. Even the kid who always tapped his pen stopped. When the clip ended, a girl in the back, hoodie up, hand trembling over her spiral notebook, murmured just loud enough to be heard, "That sounds like my mom." No one laughed, no one teased. Mrs. Kelton walked to the whiteboard and, without a word, wrote, "You don't need a title to speak for a nation." She turned around, marker still in hand. "Tomorrow I want each of you to write a letter, not for a grade, not for me, for someone who needs to be heard." There were no groans, just quiet nods. In that silence, something subtle stirred. Not activism, not outrage, just recognition, the kind that moves slower than a protest, but deeper than applause. Months had passed. The news cycle had spun on. New headlines, new fights. But the letter, it still lived. J.D. Vance pulled up to a modest brick home in Middletown, Ohio. The driveway was cracked. The porch light flickered. A wind chime clinked against the gutter, like an echo waiting for words. Marlene opened the door herself, hair in a loose braid, wearing the same army hoodie she had when they first met. No reporters, no microphones, just 2 cups of coffee and the hum of a box fan in the corner. They sat at her kitchen table. A flag folded in a glass frame watched over them from the mantel. Neither said much. J.D. finally broke the quiet. "They're listening now." Marlene didn't smile at first. She stared into her coffee, steam rising like breath too tired to speak. Then softly, "You didn't save me, but you made them hear me." He looked up. Her eyes didn't glisten. They burned. Not with tears, but with a calm fire that said, "I was always enough. You just made them notice." Before he left, she handed him a small, hand-sewn pouch. Inside, her son's dog tags. "I want this on your desk. Next time they forget who they're voting for." He paused, then nodded. No promises, just understanding. Months later, a building opened in Columbus. No ribbon cutting, no celebrities, just families and workers standing in the Ohio rain, waiting. A modest bronze plaque read, "Letters that Speak, a foundation for the forgotten." Inside, a wall of glass cases. Each held a letter, written by hand, typed on typewriters, scribbled on diner napkins. Notes from veterans, single mothers, factory workers, school janitors, street buskers, parolees. Each one told a truth no statistic ever had. One read, "I fought for this country, then came home to an eviction notice." Another, "I raised 3 kids on night shifts and still got told to try harder." One more, in a child's handwriting. "Mom says we don't complain, but sometimes I want to." Visitors walked slowly. Some cried. Others just nodded, as if finally hearing their own echo spoken aloud. At the center stood J.D. Vance. He didn't make a speech. He didn't hold a press conference. He just pressed his hand to the glass case holding Marlene's letter. And then, as the cameras began to pack up and visitors filtered out, a voiceover, calm, grounded, unmistakably his, carried across the screen. "When they say try harder, we'll answer louder. Not with our fists, but with our truth." In a world obsessed with volume, this story reminds us that the most powerful voices often begin in silence. J.D. Vance didn't shout over the noise. He listened, then spoke with purpose. What started as a single folded letter became a movement not of outrage, but of quiet conviction. It teaches us that legacy isn't just built in office. It echoes in classrooms, kitchen tables, and the hearts of those who've long felt invisible. We're left with a question worth asking ourselves. When it's our turn to speak, will we echo the noise or leave behind something worth remembering? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.